Cheers. Hey up. Right, I'm back. Obviously, I've just taken a couple of weeks well-deserved break from the channel just to recharge my batteries. In fact, over the last week, I've not even logged onto my YouTube channel, which felt really naughty, but it was enjoyable. I needed the break. Right, this first video of 2024 probably isn't the best news, but you know, it needs some coverage because from what I can gather, not a lot of people are talking about it. And that's the ZEV mandate from the government, which starts in 2024. Zero emissions vehicles. Now, I published a video on this subject probably about a year ago. I'll see if I can find it and I'll post it in the information button, top right hand corner of the picture that you're watching now. Now, what the government proposed, obviously going back until sort of before September 2023, the deadline for the ban on sales of petrol and diesel cars and small motorcycles was due to come into effect in 2030. And then in September, everyone breathed a sigh of relief when our illustrious Prime Minister Rishi Sunak stood up and announced that it was moving that ban back to 2035. Now, it's almost certain that there's going to be a general election this year. The Conservatives that Rishi's currently heading are very unlikely to get back in again. And as we all knew at the time, this was a bit of what was apparently good news intended to bring voters back to the Conservative Party. Or was it? Now, that speech by Rishi back in September obviously was intended to make the general public think that they were still going to be able to buy petrol and diesel cars right up to the 2035 deadline. And I know that that's what people believe because I get comments from people all the time saying, oh, that's a long way away, we don't need to worry about it until, 2034, and then we'll buy our last petrol or diesel vehicle and all will be good. That'll last me out. Which I think is a clear demonstration of just how gullible people can be and how politicians take advantage of that gullibility. Because that ain't what's going to happen. In fact, you'll be lucky if you can purchase a petrol or diesel vehicle from 2030. And you may even find that by the middle or the end of this year, 2024, it's going to become very difficult to purchase a petrol or diesel car. You may have to go on to quite a long waiting list, and I'll explain why. Now, early last year, the government, well, they didn't announce it, they just told the manufacturers. It was left for people like me to sort of root it out in obscure news articles. The government created the zero emissions vehicle mandate, which was directed at manufacturers of vehicles, which went something like this. From the 1st of January 2024, 22% of all vehicles that any manufacturer in the UK sells must be zero emissions, i.e. not a hybrid, not a petrol car, not a diesel car, it must be electric only. Then in 2025, that percentage will change from 22% to a higher percentage, culminating in zero petrol or diesel cars being allowed to be sold by any manufacturer by 2030. Now, at that time, the penalties to manufacturers were going to be, along the lines of every oversold petrol car would result in a fine from the government of £15,000. That's a lot of money. And commercial vehicles, i.e. vans, would be £18,000. Now, that is a lot of money, and no manufacturer can afford to take a hit on that for each and every petrol or diesel car that they oversell. They have to comply with this regulations, otherwise, basically, they're going to put themselves out of business. They'll become bankrupt eventually. Now, the sensible, logical, reasonably minded people among you will, of course, assume that after Rishi made that announcement that the ban was going to be put back until 2035, that this ZEV mandate would also be put back by a similar length of time, and probably wouldn't commence until about 2029. But you see, that's not what they've done, because last week, on the 1st of January 2024, that mandate came into force. It's been watered down slightly, very slightly, but it's tantamount to the same thing. Basically, Rishi has just shown us all a little magic trick. Sleight of hand is announced that they're not going to ban petrol and diesel vehicles until 2035, but he's made it so that it's going to be impossible for you to buy either of those vehicles from 2030. In fact, it's going to get progressively more difficult to obtain a new petrol or diesel vehicle going forward from last week. As of the 1st of January this year, that's, as I say, just over a week ago, 22% of all motor cars sold in the UK and vans must be zero emissions, i.e. electric vehicles. Actually, I tell a lie, it's 10% for vans, but again, that percentage is going to increase. Hybrid vehicles will still be classed, the same as a petrol or diesel for the purposes of this mandate, because they use fuel, they're not zero emissions. And those percentages are going to be increased each year, so that by 2030, 80% of all motor cars and vans sold for the use on the UK roads must be solely electric powered, zero emissions vehicles. And of course that means that by 2030 only 20% of cars and vans sold can be petrol or diesel. So it doesn't take a genius to work out that by 2030, just 6 years away, it's going to be virtually impossible to obtain a new petrol or diesel motor car. Now, of course, this differs slightly from the original proposed mandate, because by 2030, 100% of sales had to be electric only. But that has now been relaxed very slightly, but it's tantamount to the same thing. It's going to have the same effect. By 2030, there are going to be huge waiting lists for petrol or diesel cars. It's going to get to the point where, this year, next year, the year after, I don't know when exactly, manufacturers are going to have to start rationing out petrol and diesel vehicles, which will create waiting lists. There is absolutely no doubt that that is going to happen. Now, the reason for this is quite clear. Last year, the motor industry announced that electric vehicle sales have reached a saturation point. In fact, year on year for the past 3 years, the number of electric vehicles sold has gradually fallen. Now, the actual statistics are a little bit difficult to decipher, because depending on which source you go to, they're all quite different. But about 4 years ago, so we're told, electric vehicles had reached the point where they sort of occupied 38% of the new vehicle market. Now, that figure's a little bit artificial, because at that time, hybrid vehicles were classed, they were put in the same class as an electric vehicle. So that held those figures artificially high. And then, of course, about 2.5-3 years ago, Boris Johnson told us that hybrids were going to be banned as well. So that had to be taken out of the equation. Suffice to say, year on year, those figures have dropped. So the official figures as of December 2023 was that only 16.8% of vehicles sold for use on the British roads last year were electric. Although some sources are quoting that to be 19.8%. Either way, we've got a deficit to, this new regime, this new mandate of between 2.2% and around about 5 or 6%. So they're going to have to sell more electric vehicles this year than they did last year. Basically, they're forcing the sale of electric vehicles upon people, even though officially the ban hasn't arrived yet. It's 11 years away. Now, this doesn't just apply to cars, passenger vehicles, it also applies to vans, certainly car-derived vans, and I think it goes up as far as sort of Ford Transit type vans, including long wheelbase versions, but don't quote me on that because it's actually very difficult to get to the bottom of what is included and what isn't. Now, under the original provision, manufacturers were going to be charged £18,000 per van, petrol diesel van oversold. They've sort of cut a little bit of slack for the manufacturers this year. It's only going to be £9,000, but it will jump up to the original £18,000 at the end of 2024. Now, I remember hearing a news report last year that electric vehicles were now considered a luxury purchase. They were held up as a status symbol. That's the way owners perceived them when they bought them. And when you think about it, as it stands at the moment, they are actually a luxury purchase. They're far more expensive. I think generally accepted they're about 30% more expensive than their petrol or diesel counterpart. They're nowhere near as practical. They have very limited ranges. Charging takes a long time, if you can find a charger. The ranges drop even further during the winter months when it's cold, and of course, you know, if you want to keep yourself warm while you're driving them, that pulls it down even further. And residual resale value is extremely low. In fact, we've had reports of some dealerships refusing to take electric cars in as a part exchange item once they've exceeded 3 years of age. So they are a luxury purchase for people that can afford to buy that luxury. So the UK government is effectively forcing the sort of poor, downtrodden working man, the less well off in this country, into purchasing a luxury item. Now, the reasons behind this, as we all know, is that the UK government doesn't want your average working person to have his or her own personal transport. That is what all this is about. The crossing every T and dotting every I along the way to ensure that it becomes increasingly more difficult to have independent motorised transport. Trudy Harrison announced a couple of years ago, Trudy Harrison, of course, being Minister for the Department of Transport, that the time of vehicle ownership is so last century, and from now on you're going to walk, cycle, or catch a bus. That is what this is really all about. Now, usually when I'm making these sort of videos, viewers get to this sort of stage in the video and then they immediately jump into the comments section and say something along the lines of, you know, this is great news for me because I have a 5-year-old Ford and my wife has a 3-year-old Toyota. Substitute those with whatever manufacturer you like. And the value of second-hand cars are going to skyrocket, so we're going to be quids in. Well, no, you're not really, are you? Unless you sell those cars and don't replace them, then you'll make some profit, but you'll have no personal motorised transport. That's what the government wants. And of course, if you sell those cars and then trade up to something a bit newer, the same sort of price increase is going to be on that newer car, so you're not going to be any better off. It's all relative. And we get the comments that says, oh no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rush out and buy a load of old bangers and make a huge profit on them. Well, you won't make a huge profit on them. ULEZ and other similar schemes, they're on the increase. Older cars that don't meet the emissions regulations relevant to those particular schemes are worthless. No one wants them because it costs them a fortune to drive them around any of the major cities. And even if they meet the emission standards for those cities now, those cities are in the future going to raise the emission standards required. So it might meet those emission standards now, but it might not in a year's time or 2 years' time. They've got you stitched up from every direction. And don't forget, if the Labour Party gets into power this year, which is very likely, Sir Keir Starmer has already announced that he will be moving the ban back to 2030 from 2035. And they've also intimated that the Labour Party will instigate a nationwide ULEZ scheme, so every city will be affected. Whichever way you look at it, as motorists, we are stuffed. Unless we get a party into power that is going to reverse all this, which I think is very unlikely. This is, as they say, the beginning of the end. Now, partly the reason for lower sales than last year of electric vehicles were that from November, a lot of manufacturers that make petrol and electric cars were holding back the delivery of electric vehicles. Had been ordered but were artificially being delayed until 2024. The reason being that they can then sort of flood the market with electric vehicles that have already been ordered and artificially raise their figures of electric cars sold for 2024. The reason being, they know that the demand for them is simply not going to be there this year. And it gives them a little bit of breathing space to allow them to sell more petrol and diesel cars. That's only going to work in this one instance in the crossover from 23 to 24. They're not going to be able to do that again. It's a one-off. Now, I was going to put this video out last October, but, you know, when I put the original video out on this subject, I got such a pushback from people. You know, this is just a proposal, it'll never go ahead, you're a conspiracy theorist, blah, 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 blah. And it's so time-consuming dealing with these people. So I thought what I'd do, I would wait until January, see if it really did come into force. And then I'm telling you news rather than telling you about a proposal or some sort of conspiracy theory. It is now fact. Deal with it. So, in that period where I've been waiting to put this video out, I've put a lot of thought into how manufacturers are going to deal with this. Certainly, they're looking at a big hit in sales going forward from now. So they're going to have to do something if they're going to stay afloat. I think the most likely, and probably the first port of call, is they're going to have to substantially increase the retail prices of the petrol and diesel cars. A, to discourage people wanting them, in the hope that they may go to electric cars. And they've got some extra money in the pot that they can do one of two things with. They can either put it in the pocket because they're going to need it in the future as sales die off, or they can use that extra cash to reduce the price of electric cars to make them more attractive. So your petrol and your diesel owner, you know, the purchasers of the new cars, are going to be subsidising electric vehicles yet again. But I should sort of express at this point that it's purely supposition on my part, but I think it's very likely. Now, the other thing they can do, of course, is start pushing EVs at fleet owners, fleet sales. You know, they're getting sort of bulk sales in one go, which would push up the percentage of EVs sold. But I think that's going to be a bit of an uphill struggle. And I've got a little anecdotal story I can tell you to close this video on that. I have a relative who works for a large logistics company. I only see him sort of once a year at Christmas. My partner's family have a bit of a get-together, and that's generally the only time I see him and speak to him. And at the end of 2021, he proudly announced to me that in the middle of 2022, he would be getting a new Tesla as a company vehicle. At that point, he had an Audi. It was quite an old Audi. I think it had been passed on from upper management to him to use for a couple of years. Now, it wasn't the top of the range Tesla. I can't remember now which actual model he was proposing, but it didn't have a huge range, a couple of 100 miles, something like that. And I remember asking him how that was going to work, because I know he travels huge miles every week. The company that he works for doesn't like him staying over in hotels because they have to foot the bill. So for the most part, he's expected to travel or commute daily, and it can be anything up to a couple of 100 miles a day. both ways. And I don't think he'd really thought about that. He was just really pleased because he was going to be getting a new Tesla sometime in the middle of 2022. He was in the second wave, and the more senior representatives or operatives of his company were going to be getting their Teslas in January. Now, the following Christmas 2022, I rocked up to his house fully expecting to see a Tesla being parked up on his driveway, but instead there was a brand new petrol-powered Volkswagen Golf. During the course of the get-together, I asked him, where his Tesla was and why he had a new Golf, and he told me this story. From day one, when the first sort of wave of Teslas were introduced to the fleet, they had enormous problems with operatives being stranded at the locations that they'd been sent to because they hadn't been able to get the vehicles charged to return home, so that the company had to foot the bill for a hotel, which they weren't happy about. Bearing in mind this is winter time when the sort of low ranges on these vehicles are reduced even further. They'd found that during the cold winter months these Teslas wouldn't reach anywhere near the stated range that they'd understood they would reach when they took them on. So they were having to pay operatives overtime because they were having to stop to recharge, which was causing considerable delays in order to reach the designated locations, with some of them not even being able to reach the destinations in the same day. Now, the company had put out an order at one point that they weren't allowed to use their car heaters in order to preserve the range of the cars, which almost caused industrial action. And then in April there was an annual meeting that all the operatives had to meet up at a particular hotel to go through a day of sort of, lectures and speeches from upper management. Now, they'd chosen this particular hotel because it had 3 electric car chargers. But at that point they had 9 Teslas, and each of the sort of upper management that were attending this meeting also had electric Mercedes, and of course they got there first, so when all the operatives arrived the chargers were all in use. And the entire day turned into complete chaos, with everybody scrambling for chargers when they became available. The end result being that 3 of the operatives were unable to charge the car by the end of the day, and the firm had to put them up in what was a rather expensive hotel for the night. The second wave of Teslas was cancelled, and my understanding is that the company actually took a hit and returned the original Teslas that they'd received back to Tesla, or whoever it was that they'd leased them from, and replaced them all with new petrol cars, because they were just costing the business a fortune. Not just with the associated costs, but also with the loss of business, because people just weren't able to get to their allocated designations when they needed to be there. So, as I say, pushing fleet sales of electric vehicles I think is going to be a bit of an uphill struggle. Right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. It's good to be back. I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like on this video and consider subscribing to the channel if you're not already a subscriber. I am of course going to be back on Friday, so until then, if you're riding, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.